You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of March 2026 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist, and I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up today, could Cuba be Donald Trump's next target for military action? We'll be exploring the heightened rhetoric around the island even as the war in Iran rages on. After that,
the regimes in Russia and Iran are brothers in hatred. And that is why they are brothers in weapons. And we want regimes built on hatred to never win in anything.
We'll review Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to London and his speech before the British Parliament. We'll also round up the newspapers from the Middle East, talk about why China is relaunching train and plane travel to North Korea, and then...
Couldn't we seize the soft power moment and find some fresh ideas that speak to the nation as it is today?
Monocle's editor Josh Fennert there, dissecting the Bank of England's campaign to add wildlife to British banknotes. We'll also get a health update on vaccines in the US and meningitis here in the UK. We've got news of a jewellery powerhouse at Kering. And finally, we'll have tech gadgets galore brought right here to the studio by our tech correspondent David Phelan. That's all up ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. Very happy Wednesday to all of our listeners around the world. First of all, a look at what else is happening in the news. Iran has targeted Israel's Tel Aviv with cluster munitions from missiles in what it said was retaliation for the killing of Iran's security chief, Ari Larijani. A U.S. judge has ordered 1,000 staffers from the media outlet Voice of America to head back to work on Monday. And Venezuela has beaten the United States to win the World Baseball Classic, its first ever victory in the tournament. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, the United States has been ratcheting up its rhetoric and pressure against Cuba, which appears to be the next item on Donald Trump's hit list after Venezuela at the start of this year and the ongoing war with Iran. Cuba has been facing an economic and energy blockade, and it saw its power grid collapse at the start of this week. Trump himself has said he hoped to soon have the, quote, honor of taking Cuba. Cuba's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has said the U.S. would face unbreakable resistance if it chose to invade the island. Well, I'm joined now in the studio, right here in the studio, by Antonio Sampaio, expert on Latin American politics and security. Antonio, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Tell us, first of all, before we get to the back and forth of threats and rhetoric that we've been hearing, what you understand of the situation currently, the economic and energy situation in Cuba.
So the situation in Cuba is worse than usual because despite the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba having been in place for decades, the de facto embargo and blockade of oil to the island has caused more economic calamity than usual, and the situation has reached such a point that even the president Miguel Diaz-Canel has said that the island has not received oil in 3 months, and basically all of the electricity in Cuba is generated by oil. And the situation has reached a point in which there are health consequences of that. So rubbish trucks have not been able to run most of the time, and also even hospitals are being affected by power cuts. So it's not just being a matter of comfort or even of industrial and economic development, because basically Cuba has been denied industrialization by the trade blockade, the trade embargoes. It's now a matter of urgency in people's health and lives as well are at risk.
Now, obviously, it is hard to know in a place like Cuba exactly what people will think, but I'm curious if you get the sense, we've seen some sporadic protests, but where does the blame for this lie, when you look at Cubans themselves, are they looking to their own regime, which the U.S. wants out, or are they rallying around this regime as the U.S. threats ratchet up?
Yeah, there are signs that there are some cracks in the Cuban population's acquiescence or low-key support to the regime. So one of the strongest signs has been a report by Reuters that there has been an attack by Cubans, by the population in a small town in Cuba against the headquarters of the Communist Party there in the city of Moron. And then there are also reports of Cubans banging pots at sundown in some cities, including Havana. So those are some signs of cracks in the population support. The president has directly addressed this issue of blame, saying that the government's not to blame, and saying that the U.S. was the cause of it, and an official even saying in English on social media that the U.S. should be happy that about the harm that it has caused to the Cuban population. So it's clearly trying to transfer the blame to the U.S. side.
When it comes to what might happen next, and as perhaps crazy it is after just the start of this year to make these kind of comparisons, but we've seen what happened in Venezuela. We see what's happening currently in Iran. I'm curious where Cuba fits into that for you in terms of what would actually happen if the U.S. did try and go for regime change as it wants. What does the Cuban government in that sense look like? Do you imagine a Venezuelan situation where this is all about the leader in Miguel Diaz-Canel, or is it about the entire government needing to go for the U.S. to be satisfied?
I think the perception of the U.S. administration, especially Trump, and the perception of, let's say, many experts or even all of the experts are quite different. So it's clear that the U.S. has adopted, as I think the New York Times has put it very well in a recent article, that its doctrine, at least for Latin America in terms of Venezuela and what appears to be in Cuba, is not regime change, but regime acquiescence or regime compliance. So it's changing just the top level and saying to the one that comes next, you have to do what we say, and striking deals behind closed doors. And to give an example of that, in the report, especially by the New York Times, that about the negotiations taking place between U.S. and Cuba, the Castro family, especially Raúl Rodriguez Castro, grandson of Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, is said to be talking directly to Marco Rubio, who is a Cuban American. And so that says that a lot about the sort of attitude that the president has. Now, how this will be, it seems that the U.S. is trying to do that without a military intervention, which will be, another sort of new situation for us to analyze. Trump is doing a lot of new stuff. But whether that will be seen as a success, as a victory, or whether that will have any impact in terms of economic policies in the island and also in terms of freedoms and political freedoms, which have always been, one of the issues that the U.S. criticizes, the Cuban regime the most about, which is, freedoms and oppression of the people. Whether that will change in any way just by changing the top person, it's very, very unclear.
That is what's quite striking about this, is it not, Antonio? Because to compare it to Venezuela, all we have seen there too is the removal of the head. But I'm curious also if you can compare it there. I mean, Venezuela, life has not necessarily changed. The policies of a Venezuelan government have not necessarily changed. Is this then, for the U.S., do we get the impression, purely about whether this is a regime that, as you say, acquiesces to U.S. demands, but that it's not actually about any additional freedoms for the Cubans themselves?
Yeah, it seems this way, and it seems that the U.S. and the Trump regime has adopted a very superficial view of political change, which is not informed by any views about the importance of institutions and the importance of like deep-rooted political elites that remain, the power behind the throne. So it's looking for a sort of a public relations almost victory, and on the top level. In terms of Cuba, it's very difficult to predict how deep the current negotiation team with the U.S. is willing to commit in terms of changes in political structure, in the communist regime's grip over the island. I doubt that they have any power to say that or to do that. So it's difficult to know if the U.S. will be satisfied with that and whether it will adopt any military approach to take out the top levels. But it seems very clear that the U.S. has this fixed idea of changing the top level, claiming victory, and claiming to be in control in very shadowy ways, in very opaque ways that is very difficult for the U.S. Taxpayers and citizens who, what are we in control of? What is my government, in control of outside of my own country? So it's very opaque and very new to foreign relations and international affairs.
Antonio Sampaio, expert on Latin American politics and security. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is The Globalist. It is around 9:11 in Kyiv and 7:11 here in London. Now, Ukraine and the United Kingdom have signed a new defense partnership with President Volodymyr Zelensky in London for meetings with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, among others. Zelensky also visited Buckingham Palace, spoke before the British Parliament, as Kyiv works to keep global support for Ukraine going at a time of many distractions in the Middle East, and also to avoid Russia benefiting from the war in Iran. Well, I'm joined now by Lesia Vasilenko, Ukrainian lawyer, MP, and co-chair of the Ukraine-UK Parliamentary Friendship Group in Kyiv. Lesia, thanks so much for coming back on our show. Let's start with this defense pact between the UK and Ukraine. How big a deal is that?
It's an important document in the strategic implementation of the 100-year partnership that has been signed by our countries a year ago. It's more than just a declaration of intent. It shows that Ukraine and the UK are moving on to cooperation on security, on mutual development of defense capacities, and that they are strengthening their collective and mutual defense readiness.
Now,
in a world of today, this is crucial to reinforcing deterrence and contributing to a long-term security, not just in our respective countries, the Ukraine and the UK, but also in Europe as a whole.
I wanted to touch on one aspect of this defense pact as well, which is drone technology. Tell us a little bit about that, because this has been linked even to what is happening, of course, the war in Iran, joint drone production. This is something that's been highlighted by the war in Iran. How much has Ukraine sought to kind of parlay its expertise on drone technology into maintaining influence, support for its own war?
Ukraine has acquired unique expertise over the past 4 years, now going on 5, since Russia's aggression escalated in 2022. The drones have become the new AK-47 of modern warfare. We are innovating as we fight battle after battle. The Russians are too, by the way, and so are the allies of Russia, such as Iran, China, North Korea. They have the same technologies, and we must be aware of that. And the consequences of the availability of that technology are now much felt in the Middle East. Ukraine has already sent over 200 experts and engineers to train the military in Gulf countries to help them withstand the Iranian attacks. But there's more to come, as was this new agreement that has been signed between Ukraine and the UK. The UK and Ukraine will establish joint ventures, joint production lines for drones, joint R&D programs in the mil-tech ecosystem. And we also intend to integrate defense supply chains and promote industrial partnerships. That means that there will be space for new companies to develop. Defense startups will emerge, joint ventures between UK and Ukraine, but also there will be space for the primes, for the big defense industry to evolve and develop into the new mil-tech that's available today, and that is much needed on the front lines.
Now, Lesia, Volodymyr Zelensky made a point, as well as you have done there, of sort of directly linking Iran and Russia in his speech before the British Parliament. Keir Starmer did, for that matter, as well, in terms of this worry that Russia could benefit from the reduction in sanctions, the temporary easing of sanctions on oil. How much are Ukrainians feeling that the war in Iran could have an actual material impact on the war, not just the sense that Iran is drawing away resources from Ukraine, but actually boosting the coffers of Russia?
Unfortunately, this is a very real threat. When the US announces that they're willing to temporarily lift the sanctions, we in Ukraine have an allergy to the word temporary, because for us, anything that's temporary can quickly become permanent. So this lifting of the sanctions means the renewal of Russian oil and gas commodities on international markets. And once the door is open, even if it's just a small, tiny little crack, it's a matter of time that that door will be wide open and Russian commodities will flow into international markets again. Let's not forget that sanctions are working as long as they are implemented to their fullest. And the reason why some experts are saying that sanctions are failing or have not been as effective is because many loopholes remain and remained always to circumvent these sanctions by Russia and Russian officials. For us, this is a completely unacceptable situation. This is the situation which gives many Ukrainians the feeling that Ukraine has always been given just enough not to fall completely, but never enough to bring that much awaited and hoped for victory and with it the long-term peace that not just Ukraine, but Europe and the world deserve.
Lesia, when you talk about temporary versus permanent there, I did want to bring in as well the Belgian Prime Minister here, because his comments this week that relations with Russia should start to be normalized is perhaps what you're talking about there, this move from temporary to permanent. There has been a strong reaction to that from other European leaders, including Kaja Kallas. But are you hearing that sort of rhetoric more often these days from Europeans? And what can Ukraine do to counter that?
Ukraine is doing what it can. It's fighting its battles on our land. Ukraine is fighting a war, a European war, on Ukrainian soil. And that's the best that we can do and will keep on doing to counter any comments and show by our example that this is the consequences that you have when you try to appease the aggressor. And they last a lifetime and they leave a scar and multiple scars on generations to come. Whereas for the comments, of course, there's going to be more of them as long as there's endorsement from across the Atlantic, from the leadership of the US. We are very grateful for that matter to Kaja Kallas and the leadership of the EU for standing strong with Ukraine and for immediately uprooting any such even notions that the EU could follow suit and live the same same sanctions. This will be devastating not just for Ukraine and Ukraine's efforts, but it will be devastating for any hope that Europeans might still have that this war will be over was a long-lasting peace. Again, appeasing the aggressor never worked. It never worked in Europe. It never worked anywhere else in the world. If Russia gets its way, if Russia gets more resources to fight wars, it will do so, and it will continue its expansionist war. Let's not forget that Russia is fighting not just for a small piece of land. No matter how much land Russia is given, Russia will want more because it's a colonial war which does not stop at Ukraine, which goes way beyond the borders of Ukraine, and which goes at least up to the borders of the former Russian Empire in the form of the Soviet Union. But you never know what the appetites of the modern Russian leadership are. And trust me, that was Putin's ambitions to go down in history as the man who reinstalled the greatness of Russia. Those ambitions are big and have very little limits unless stopped and unless pushed back.
Lesia Vasilenko, Ukrainian MP in Kyiv, thank you very much for joining us today. Still to come in the program.
mRNA vaccines don't perform well against viruses that infect the upper respiratory tract.
RFK Jr., the U.S. Health Secretary, his hopes of limiting vaccines, as you heard there, have been dashed by an American court. We'll talk about health news with Chris Smith. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS's Chief Investment Office House View, we're focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals, so you get the big picture broken down into thought-provoking insights. Delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers on The Globalist. And joining me for that is Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent in Istanbul. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
Good to have you here. And there is a lot of news to get through out of the Middle East, and particularly Iran, of course. There's so much news every day. And we wanted to start in this case with, as I touched on in our headlines, Israel's killing of the Iranian security chief, Ari Larijani. How significant a deal is that?
This would appear to be an extremely significant moment. Mentioned, for example, in the AP coverage, that Larijani was considered one of the most powerful figures in the country since the killing of the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei about 3 weeks ago. Larijani had really emerged as one of the faces of the regime. He was seen walking in the streets during the annual Quds Day parade last week, which was really considered this huge act of defiance. And we've already seen that Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, has given an interview to Al Jazeera where he's tried to claim that that there is essentially a misunderstanding at the heart of this, that Iran, in his words, has a strong political structure, and so the killing of one individual is not going to make any difference. That is not the assessment elsewhere, certainly not overseas. Some interesting coverage in the New York Times, for example, about whether, in their words, killing a top Iranian leader like Mr. Larijani could prove counterproductive depending on who takes his place. Namely, in the words of a former Mossad official, potentially someone who is much more hardline, less pragmatic, less likely to play a role, or was, Larijani was considered someone who could play a role in future negotiations, someone who could be spoken to, negotiated with, as he has led in the past. And so killing him would appear to be a blow to any future negotiation.
And another story related to Iran, Ruth, while we've had this story about the killing of Ari Larijani, back in the United States, we've actually seen the first resignation over the war in Iran. Tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. This is Joe Kent, the so far highest level American official to resign over the war in Iran. He posted his resignation letter on social media yesterday, essentially saying that he cannot, in his words, in good conscience, support the ongoing war in Iran. And so really undermining the Trump administration's claims about the necessity of going to war in Iran in the first place. We've already seen that Trump has hit back at him, calling him, weak on security. Worth mentioning, as we're seeing in some of the coverage, particularly in the BBC, that Joe Kent was someone who was a really long-time stalwart Trump supporter, somebody who had faced a lot of criticism for his links to extremist groups, including members of the Proud Boys. And so really, in many ways, what this is about is not just that you have this high-level official resigning over the war, but it's also about the splits emerging on the right and on the hard right, to the extreme right of Donald Trump himself, over the war in Iran, and over the accusation by Joe Kent that the administration basically decided to go to war because of input from Israeli officials.
Well, and speaking of Israel, we wanted to touch on a story from there as well, Ruth. You have the story about an Israeli reporter that claims he's getting death threats from gamblers.
Yes, this is a pretty sorry indictment of not just the media, but I think the world that we live in. So this is the Times of Israel reporter, Emmanuel Fabian, who has this incredible story in the Times of Israel. It's gotten a lot of pickup, understandably, overseas, about essentially being deluged by threats and calls, including threats on his life, over his reporting of a bombing, an Iranian missile striking Iran earlier this month, and that he came to find out that the source of this was gamblers on the site Polymarket, who had placed something like $9 billion worth of total bets. $900,000 worth of total bets. Bit of a gap there financially and what people stand to lose. That there's just this huge amount of gambling on a real world incident, and that he was then getting death threats demanding that he change his story so that it would allow people to win money, and that if he didn't change the story, that that there would essentially be a threat to his life. And so he quite rightfully has this story about what this means for the ability to report real world events in the media, and the interaction with something like Polymarket, which is allowing people to gamble on events, even airstrikes or missile strikes.
It is pretty incredible what Polymarket has been doing to sort of these geopolitical considerations and gambling. But finally, Ruth, you do bring us some more happier news, different news for our final story. I've been reading this as well. Reuters has done this deep investigation claiming to have unmasked Banksy.
Yes. Incredible long investigation by Reuters, which also includes a justification of why unmask Banksy at all, the infamous anonymous, until now, graffiti artist. Reuters identifies him as a man who was born under the name Robin Gunningham, who was actually previously unmasked by the Daily Mail back in 2008. Reuters found a police report in New York and a court filing associated with his arrest for painting on a billboard in New York in the year 2000. The Guardian asks, why should we care? And then says, we probably shouldn't. The greatest trick Banksy ever pulled wasn't making a painting shred itself. It was disguising a middle-aged bloke from Bristol, probably with kids and a mortgage, as a global urban gorilla laughing at us behind his comfy Marks and Spencer hoodie for the past 30 years. The New York Times also asked, A question that Reuters brought up in their reporting, which how might this affect the resale of his artwork, and then essentially concludes that, citing one art buyer, the majority of Banksy buyers don't care about his identity or want to know his identity. So maybe this explosive investigation in the end will have no effect at all.
Poor Banksy being undermined by his own revelations or the revealing of his own name. Ruth Michelson, Middle East correspondent in Istanbul, thank you very much for joining us. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now here's a look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Iran has targeted Israel's Tel Aviv with cluster munitions in missiles in what it said was retaliation for the killing of Iran's security chief Ari Larijani, which Israel's defense minister announced yesterday. At least 2 people have been killed in the overnight strikes. A U.S. judge has ordered more than 1,000 staffers from Voice of America to head back to work on Monday. The congressionally backed media organization has been dismantled by the Trump administration. U.S. District Judge Royce Lambert had already ruled last month that the head of the agency's parent company, Kari Lake, had been improperly appointed to the role. South Korea says it has secured 24 million barrels of crude from the UAE to ease a fuel crisis in the country. About 70% of South Korea's crude supply typically passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which has been closed by Iran amid its war with the U.S. and Israel. And Venezuela has beaten the United States to win the World Baseball Classic. It is Venezuela's first ever victory in the sport's top global competition. They beat the U.S. 3-2 in the final held in Miami. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It is 16:31 in Pyongyang, 8:31 in Zurich. Let's turn now to North Korea, one of the world's most reclusive nations, which is getting a renewed travel boost as China has resumed train travel to the country and this week announced that flights, too, will resume at the end of this month. Well, I'm joined now by John Everard, former UK ambassador to North Korea, among other places. John, I feel like I have to start with how you, back in the day, traveled to North Korea.
Well, I was kind of fortunate. There were both Air China and Air Koryo flights. So you could actually fly between Pyongyang and Beijing most days of the week. To be honest, I never took the train. The train kept and probably does keep breaking down. And, the journey between Pyongyang and Beijing can get really tedious.
I can imagine that. What was the flight like? Just what kind of people were on flights to North Korea from China?
The usual weirdos and misfits. Assorted diplomats, aid workers, ne'er-do-well businessmen, and a lot of North Korean and Chinese officials, of course. The flights, Air Koryo fails every known flight safety measure. You board with a kind of deep intake of breath. Air China, of course, is a reputable airline. And Air Koryo is distinguished by being the only airline I know where you can haggle over the onboard services. They'll come around with a tray full of Korean handicrafts and tell you how much they cost, and you can say, no, I'm not paying that, until negotiate a price halfway down.
Haggling on the plane. I love it. Well, just tell us then, to bring us to this moment, what is behind this? Why has China made this decision to reopen travel now after about 6 years, I understand?
The quick answer, as so often with North Korea, is nobody really knows. The block never was on the Chinese side. It was on the North Korean side. They had very, very fierce lockdown over the pandemic, and they never quite got round to reopening. They let their own airline fly to China starting about 3 years ago. Air Koryo has been flying since about 2023, but they didn't seem to want the Chinese airlines to compete. And why now the train service? Nobody quite knows. Curiously, they've restricted that to what they call business travel only, though how that's ever going to be monitored or checked, heaven only knows. Now, of course, China being China, as soon as the new transport facilities were announced, about a dozen different Chinese tour agencies jumped on the bandwagon and are now advertising 8-day tours of North Korea for between $1,000 and $1,300. You can secure your place with just $250. Curiously, none of them, though, include the one thing that we thought the North Koreans were building up to for Chinese tourism, which is a huge Wonsan Kalma, the beach resort that we were talking about in the studio about this time last year. So far, only Russians and North Koreans have been to be able to go there.
So is there an expectation that Chinese might be able to go there as well now that travel is resuming, or what actually happens with that?
This is the big question at the moment. Once again, we don't know. Everybody thought that the whole point of the resort was to suck lots of Chinese tourist dollars out of the Chinese economy, but the North Koreans haven't played it that way. In fact, there's no certainty that Chinese tourists will be allowed in at all. And I know this will shock you, Chris. There are people out there saying that this is just another rip-off by Chinese tour agencies. That what they're doing is taking deposits from people, knowing full well that tourism isn't going to resume, so that in a few months' time, they hand the deposits back, having had them sitting gaining interest all that time.
So if tourism is not the reason for this, and as you say, we don't really know much about this, but what would North Korea like from China now that travel is resuming?
More money. I mean, the usual North Korean baking bowl is being held out. More contacts. The North Koreans have realized that their warm relationship with Russia may be time limited. Big questions over what happens once the Ukraine war ends and Russia's insatiable demand for North Korean troops and munitions starts to ebb a bit. And they've been reaching out to China. Big meetings between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, of course, and a lot more delegations exchanged between the two countries. So this could just be part of a wider pattern of warming between the two countries.
John, it's interesting that you mentioned the war in Ukraine there, because I'm also actually curious how the war in Iran has been impacting North Korea. Are there any worries there? Is that a reason for North Korea to maybe want to be boosting relations with China again, to have an ally?
Big worries. One of the less documented side effects of the war in Iran is that China, of course, gets about 15% of its crude oil from Iran, so the loss of that supply is a big hit, has banned all oil exports. Now, the only way that North Korea gets oil is through China, and it's not clear how much, if any, oil at the moment is going from China into North Korea. If the Chinese actually do hold back the oil originally earmarked for North Korea for their own domestic use, then North Korea's got a big problem. But the situation still is a little bit unclear. We're not quite sure what's happening there.
But that is an incredible fact. I mean, we started this show talking about Cuba, which is also facing this oil blockade as a result of what the U.S. is doing. So North Korea is basically facing the same thing right now.
It could be. As I say, we don't really know how much oil the Chinese are letting through. It may be that they simply reduce the flow and North Korea's still got just about enough oil to carry on. Neither side are releasing figures.
John Everard, former UK ambassador to North Korea, thank you very much for joining us. You're with Monocle Radio. Well, let's turn to some health news now, both here in the UK and the US. In the UK, there's been a rare outbreak of meningitis, but in the United States, a court has halted US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s efforts to remake vaccine policy for children. Well, we're joined now by Chris Smith, virologist at Cambridge University and managing editor of The Naked Scientists. Chris, great to have you back on the show. Let's start with here in the UK. If I could, how unprecedented is this meningitis outbreak?
Well, it's a big one. We don't normally get this sort of thing on this sort of scale, thankfully. Meningitis is a bacterial infection. Usually, bacterial infections spread at a lower pace. With viruses which go through the air, like COVID, we see big numbers in a range of settings quite quickly. But with bacterial infections, they're normally a bit more self-contained. So we've got a very big group of people who've been exposed and unfortunately relatively large group of people who have caught the infection and some unfortunate people who've passed away, showing how serious this is.
And do we have a sense, Chris, of how this started and why?
No. I mean, the bottom line is that most people at some point in their lives will run into these infections and we just brush them off. And a proportion, maybe 1 in 4 young people will carry Neisseria meningitidis, which is the bacterium that causes bacterial meningitis, in their nose and throat anyway. So we've got this sort of double-edged problem here, which is on the one hand, the bacteria that cause the infection are quite common, and they can also be carried harmlessly. They don't invade and cause an infection in people. And so when you've got that combination of it's carried by people, it's out there, and then you've got a a group of people who are spending a lot of time together. Close personal contact is how this spreads, with sharing drinks, sharing kisses, sharing close space in noisy environments where you're forced to shout at each other to make yourself heard, like clubs and pubs and that kind of thing. You're more likely to transmit. And so we've got this unfortunate combination of factors with a group of individuals that also escaped vaccination when they were younger for this particular organism, and that's making life a bit more challenging.
And what actually needs to happen then, from your perspective, Chris, in order to contain this outbreak? It's currently in Kent. I mean, how likely is it to actually spread elsewhere?
I think it's less likely to go elsewhere because the bacteria go where the people go. And this is a defined outbreak in one geography, which is in a fairly tight geography. And unless the people are all moving all over the place, which, as far as we can tell, they're not, then it's more likely to stay localised. But it's a sort of barometer, a bellwether of the fact that this is out there, this can happen, and there might be vulnerable groups, including people who are or under vaccinated. And we know we're seeing a lot of different infectious diseases increasing their numbers, and part of that must be lower uptake of vaccination for some of these infectious diseases.
Well, speaking of lower uptake of vaccinations, to turn to the United States, Chris, I mean, meningitis itself, the vaccine, was part of a list, I understand, of childhood vaccines that were restricted by the U.S. Health Department. Just explain these changes that we've had in the U.S. before we get to this court ruling. What was RFK Jr. and his health department trying to do? How were they restricting vaccines?
Well, there's a growing list of vaccines which we offer to young children in most Western countries, and they go for the things which A, are very common, B, very serious, and C, are easy to make safe vaccines for. And in recent years, we've added vaccines for meningitis. We didn't used to have a vaccine for one form of Neisseria meningitis, Men-B, which is actually the cause of the present outbreak here in the UK, for example. And this was introduced in 2015 for little kids because they were the ones that were most vulnerable to catching this and dying from this at that particular age. America is very similar. And unfortunately, the policies that were being advanced or advocated for by Robert Kennedy are anti-vax, and many of these vaccines were being threatened with being culled or cut back because people are making noises about the fact that I think they're seeing one side of the coin effectively. They're seeing that people claim when you expose people to vaccines, there might be some health disbenefits, but they're not looking at the other side of the story, which is, well, how many lives are being saved, how many diseases are being deferred or prevented by these really important public health initiatives. And so this is where we're at. You've got somebody who is driving a department who is very much anti-vaccination compared to where we were before, which was very much pro keeping kids as healthy as possible.
Chris, just finally looking at that, I'm curious how much advisories from governments and international agencies impact your job as a virologist. I mean, as in if there is a change in advice that you don't agree with, and then there's a court injunction, this confusion, what do you feel forced to follow as a result of that?
Well, there are prescribed national guidelines. Most Western countries with an operating health service will have prescribed national guidelines, which are regarded as the gold standard. And physicians, healthcare providers, healthcare workers are expected to toe that line because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, you've got to defend your decision. Now, that doesn't mean that you absolutely have to follow them rigidly. They're guidelines, not tramlines, because people are all different. There will always be exceptions. But at the same time, if you step off the well-trodden path, you've got to be able to defend your decision medico-legally. And so when the guidelines do change, that can create confusion. But at the bottom line, it confuses the public. And if people don't know where they stand and they don't know what the right advice is, they're more likely to do nothing than do something. And if it's things like measles vaccinations, we're seeing the fruits of people's disquiet in society now because we've got record numbers of measles cases in many countries. The US is one, but in the UK, in the last couple of years, we've had 3,000 cases of measles per year cropping up on one occasion. We've already had hundreds of cases this year alone. And this is because of under-vaccination. In some parts of the country, we're seeing vaccine rates just above half of children. That number needs to be more than 95% in order to reach herd immunity and protect everybody effectively and stop the virus spreading. So we've got big gaps opening up in our defences, and at least part of this is because of shifting guidelines and shifting information, including information spilling over from other countries, which is putting people off, I think.
Just quickly then to follow that up, Chris, I mean, does that mean you're seeing, we focus so much on the US, but it's not actually about the United States. You're seeing vaccine hesitancy grow in lots of countries.
Yes, everywhere. And if you look at rates of uptake of many of the vaccines, not just in children, but also whooping cough reared its ugly head just a few years ago. And we give whooping cough vaccines to pregnant women. The rationale for that is they will make a strong antibody response and top up any underlying immunity they already had and pass that immunity into their new baby, so the baby's protected during its vulnerable early years or early months before it can build its own immunity and have its own whooping cough vaccine. The levels of uptake of that vaccine are right down. We were close to 3/4 of women who were having that, and we're now down at around about 2/3 or half, so it's dropped right off, and we put that down to vaccine hesitancy. A lot of this is because social media doesn't have a passport, doesn't actually observe geographical boundaries across countries. It spreads around the world, and so mismessaging from one country can infect other countries and cause people to change their behaviour, and I think that's part of the problem.
Chris Smith, virologist at Cambridge University, managing editor of The Naked Scientist. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now let's take a look behind the headlines. Here is Monocle's Josh Fennert on the Bank of England opening up its design decision on the country's next banknotes.
The Bank of England's plan to replace Great Britain's depicted on banknotes with images of wildlife has become the latest front in a rather tedious culture war, one that shows pragmatism itself has lost currency. Far from trying to devalue the legacy of Jane Austen or Alan Turing, the updated designs are meant to increase security. Sadly, this hasn't stopped pot-stirring politicians from performing some pantomime outrage.
I think it's absolutely crackers.
If anything, I think that they should be putting more historical figures on banknotes.
Their deep-down worry that wanton wokery might replace Britain's hallowed, jowly, tell-it-like-it-was wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill with an oak tree or with an otter. To fall out over small change, however, is to miss both the issue and the opportunity. Britain is the world's 6th biggest economy by GDP, but is labouring with sluggish growth, pitiful productivity, and in a crisis of confidence. What would old Winston make of the electorate squabbling over whether swallows or long-dead painters should adorn the £20 note while war rages in the Middle East?
All of you will be damned.
Democracy is delightful but less important when it comes to branding and persuasive design. Couldn't we seize the soft power moment and find some fresh ideas that speak to the nation as it is today? Where's that supposed British humour when you need it? Perhaps we could venerate the slug itself to represent the post-2008 economy, or hedgerows to hint at the national obsession with borders and neighbourly squabbles. Like most things in the UK, where you sit politically conditions your response. Promoting a weeping willow at the expense of a white war leader? Well, that's a dog whistle to the right, who are already worried that national identity is diluted by politically correct liberal bedwetters. Venerating Victorian novelists or romantic painters, meanwhile, may feel a little parochial, dare I say, passé, to the progressives and lefties. What we're really missing in this debate is a little imagination, some way of depicting values we can agree on or be proud of. My worry that wildlife, although pleasant, is just the least bad option. True, you can't cancel a kingfisher or a chestnut tree, but let's not pretend that makes them an interesting or encouraging depiction of the UK today.
Monocle's Josh Fennert there. For more, you can sign up to our daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute. Head over to monocle.com/minute for that. This is The Globalist. Well, let's turn now to news from the world of jewelry, because Kering, the parent company of Gucci and so many other fashion and luxury brands, is now bringing its various jewelry brands under one roof. It's to be called Kering Jewellery, and the company is named Jean-Marc Duplé as the man to run the entire thing. Well, I'm joined now right here in the studio by Monocle's luxury markets editor, Brenda Toohey. Brenda, great to have you on the show.
Hi, Chris. Good morning.
I was, as somebody who admittedly is not always in the luxury space, I was just amazed, Brenda, to look at how much Kering has. So let's start with that before we even get to the jewelry space. They're so massive in the luxury space.
They really are. I mean, they're a huge fashion house. They have Gucci, Yves Saint Laurent, Bottega, Balenciaga, McQueen, Brioni, and I guess they want to emulate what the other houses, LVMH and Richemont, are doing with their jewelry brands.
That is it. I guess that's it. So they're kind of copying others here. Tell us about this step then, what they're doing, what kind of brands are going to be in this merged Kering jewelry.
Well, they have the very elegant, opulent Boucheron. They have the more modern, colorful, wonderful, sculptural Pomellato, the Chinese brand, Quilin, and a more entry-level, charm-led brand called Dodo, and a fine jewelry manufacturing brand called Rosselli Franco. Now, they have brought these 5 brands together, grouped them under Kering Jewellery, in order to accelerate growth and create more structure. It's a very fine combination, I might say, of jewelry. And jewelry has been performing really well, outperforming perhaps fashion. So they're quite right to stick their oar in and create this little special group.
You kind of answered my next question with the way you described these different jewelry brands. But I'm curious, when people buy jewelry, do they even think of Kering as the parent company, or are they thinking of the way that you described each individual brand has its own reason for being?
Each brand has its own cachet. I don't think they even notice that it was, Kering, Richemont, LVMH. I don't think the loyalty is to the mother company per se. It's all about the individual brand, and they're all marketed very differently. They say different things to the consumer, modernity, something kind of that fabulously romantic. Jewelry is very, very personal. And of course, one is prepared to invest quite a lot more in a piece of jewelry than perhaps in a pair of boots.
And at the same time, you did touch on the competitors of Kering, that they're kind of doing the same thing, grouping. So just tell us about that, how competitive the jewelry space is.
It's incredibly competitive, but it's not just their competitors at Richemont or LVMH. There are also family-owned jewelers that you have to throw into the mix as well. Independents, Harry Winston, the fabulous Chopard. You've got to also deal with the Graf and their wonderful huge diamonds. So there are a lot of jewelers out there scrabbling for the consumers that exist around the world. But I think that Kering has been very clever. So they're hitting and targeting very different markets. Quilin isn't the biggest jewelry brand, but it is a Chinese brand with 139 shops in China. So that's an entirely new market that the others aren't really hitting with a Chinese-owned brand. So that's quite special. And I like the way that they just have targeted consumers on many different levels. And who knows what they're going to do with Rosselli Franco. I mean, they're manufacturing beautiful, fine jewels. We're never quite sure who they actually manufacture for, but it is interesting. So I think they have quite a lot in their mix to start with.
Brenda Toohey, Monocle's luxury markets editor. Thank you very much for joining us today. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence. all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
This is The Globalist, and finally on today's show, it is time for a roundup of news and gadgets from the world of technology. I'm very excited to be joined right here in the studio by Monocle's technology correspondent, David Phelan. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
You have brought us lots of things, as you always do. I'm not sure. I think I'm most excited about the second one. But before we get to that, we are going to talk phones.
Cool. And this is, well, you've just been talking about jewellery. This is Virtu, a brand that was originally part of Nokia and set up decades ago as a luxury part of Nokia. It's now a separate company, and they make luxury handsets. This one that I'm handing you costs $5,000. Don't drop it.
Okay.
And
very careful.
It's Virtu has an interesting logo. You can see the bottom of the screen is kind of V-shaped rather than squared off, and it's a chunky, solid piece of kit. You know that you're getting something very expensive there. It has leather on the back. There are lots of different versions. You can pay much more than $5,000 for it. But this is the
so this is the entry-level version at $5,000.
Absolutely. This is the Virtu Agent Q, which has multiple agentic AI features in it, so that you can just speak to it and ask it to book a table or in a restaurant or a hotel or a flight. But the key thing that Virtu has, and it's one of the reasons it's expensive, is that behind all that, it has a real-life 24/7 concierge who can if it can step in if AI has reached its capabilities, or indeed if you just want to speak to someone.
The step beyond AI, I see. And I love that actually the screen as well shows like a very luxury watch as well for its timepiece, as if you are holding a luxury item right in your hands.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's move on to number 2. I'm very excited because I have to say I've never actually tried one of these on before myself. Okay. We're looking at some smart glasses.
Yes. These are the Even Realities G2. I did talk about them briefly just when they were announced at CES. And I'm going to pass them to you now, Chris.
You are. I have to remove my own glasses.
And these ones, don't be alarmed if you see the world in a whole new way, because they do have my... They have my
special prescription.
Exactly. And now what? But I've just turned it into. I don't know. Can you see any green lettering?
I do. I see green lettering,
and it should be changing as we speak, because there's a feature called Conversate, which as it hears words, it transcribes them in real time on the lenses.
I am getting a transcription of exactly what you were saying. I suppose it is now currently transcribing myself as I speak.
That's right. The same technology can be used to translate, or you can use it as a teleprompter, for example. This is handy if you're doing a presentation and you haven't bothered to learn your script. Feel free to take them off because obviously they are designed for my eyes.
Hazy eyes.
Sorry about that. But they're very interesting because unlike Meta Ray-Bans, which I like very much, these don't have a camera in them, so that people don't have any privacy concerns. But they are much more geared towards productivity. There are new features coming all the time. In a simpler state, you can also just have it tell you the time and the latest news. But although they do have chunky bits at the back where the batteries are, and there are chunky bits at the front where the projectors are, on the whole, they do look like regular spectacles. They come in 2 different frame shapes, according to what you like.
It is interesting, just quickly, David, the fact that you say these glasses don't have the camera. Is that sort of an understanding that there have been some concerns about smart glasses?
I think there definitely have been concerns with privacy. I suspect, though, that smart glasses will continue to have cameras in them, many of them, as we become used to the idea that a camera could be looking at us. One of the features can be that, and I know there's a privacy concern, but I would also love this, that you're walking through a room and you think, who is that guy coming towards you? And facial recognition means that it'll say, it's Chris. And that will save me a lot of embarrassment.
Well, one more thing, David, that you did bring with us here. You're unpacking it as we speak, the MacBook Neo.
Yes. Apple has just released a lot of new products, a new iPad Air, a new iPhone 17e, and some laptops. The iPhone and the iPad both go on sale for $599, £599 in the UK. And they also announced a laptop called the MacBook Neo, which is more affordable than any others. It also comes in at £599, or if you're a student, $499. But this is it. It's a 13-inch laptop, and I think it looks and feels absolutely as premium as the most expensive MacBook Pro. I'm
putting it next to my current MacBook as well.
Yes, and I think is that an Air or yes? Yes. And they're both 13-inch, although the Air has 13.6-inch display. That one's 13-inch. And there are other clever ways they've got the price down. There's no backlit keys, but as you can see, the keys are a lighter colour rather than darker, so they're easier to see in darker rooms anyway. So that's not an issue. And also, they're subtly colour-coded to the rest of the laptop. This is the one in citrus, but it also comes in indigo, blush, which is pink, and silver. And Apple has, I think it's going to be a phenomenal success for Apple because it's so much cheaper. If you're a student going off to university, you couldn't afford a MacBook Air at $1,000 or more. Instead, you could buy this for £500 on the education pricing, and it is almost as good as a MacBook Air. It's not quite, but it's really good.
It is interesting that, because I do wonder whether some of Apple's cachet has been in the price and the fact that it is more of a luxury item. Is that something that they're risking here?
Yes, that's really interesting. I mean, people have always talked about the Apple tax, that you have to pay a premium to get the Apple product. But they went out of their way to make sure that this, although it's using a different aluminium alloy, which is more affordable, they didn't in any way take away from the premium qualities. There are things like your MacBook Air has MagSafe to connect to charge it. This doesn't. This just has 2 USB-C ports. So, in other words, they're still giving you reasons to upgrade to the Air if you want that. But for the price, this is, I think, an astonishing piece of kit.
That and bringing it to a new generation of students.
Yes, indeed.
David Phelan, Monocle's tech correspondent, thank you for joining us. That's all for today's program. Thanks to our producer, Angelica Jobson, our researcher, Annalise Maynard, and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there is more music on the way. I'll be back with the briefing live at midday in London. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Chris Turmack. Thanks for listening.